Antrich und Ehre, war sich der noch angesäche. So bist du ihr aller Ehre. Was ist Wundes hier geschehen? Dass ein Magd ein Kind gebar, ihre über aller Engel schar. Was das nicht ein Wunder gab. Hier ließ sich reine taufen.
This is The New Right, a podcast for the lost arts, reclaiming the literary holy land from the heathen. This is Dan Baltic.
And this is Matt Pegas.
And this is our not our third episode.
Fourth.
This is our fourth episode. Losing count here.
Yeah, after a kind of impromptu hiatus. Not much of a hiatus, I guess. A couple weeks break, but we're back ready to knock out a bunch more.
We are back in black, as they... The title of today's episode is A Tale of Two Essays, and the two essays in question are the Flight 93 election by Michael Anton and Victis by none other than Mencius Moldbug himself,
Right?
Yarvin.
Yup. We are talking about influential 2016 essay from Michael Anton written for the Claremont Review of Books, which I now understand is like totally famous and considered to have been effective and influential in Trump's victory in 2016. I actually hadn't read it until the lead up to this episode. I guess wasn't red-pilled enough at the time. And also Curtis Yarvin, aka Mencius Moldbug's sort of post-mort on the 2020 election, published on his blog, Grey Mirror, December of last year.
That's right. And actually, I was exposed to Flight 93 at the time, but I too was not as red-pilled as I am now at that time. And I think I read it in an Andrew Sullivan column, saw a reference to it. And yeah, at the time, it struck me as very dire, and in retrospect, very prescient.
Yeah, for sure. Hey, remind me who Andrew Sullivan is?
So Andrew Sullivan was, like, in the 90s, the editor of The New Republic.
Gotcha.
Got into a big scandal because he did a fair-minded profile of Charles Murray.
Right.
And that seems to be a touchstone that gets liberals kicked out of polite society.
Seemingly so, yeah. Well, it's interesting with Sullivan then, because so look, I to speak on it, like the first time I came across Anton was his review of Bronze Age Mindset, and then I came to understand that he was a White House staffer. He was actually in tight with Trump.
So from Flight 93, he kind of jumped to notoriety. And it's an example of an anonymous essay. He was writing as an anon, and it was so widely read, and he gained notoriety from it, and he became a staffer on the National Security Council,
Right.
and was a breath away from the White House.
Exactly.
In the White House.
In the White House,
Breath away from the president.
Right. I think we talked about calling this episode possibly from anonymity to the Oval Office or something. The Tale of Two Essays is a good title too. But yeah, but Anton is. I say this because Anton is interesting because he does exemplify that perhaps better than anyone. Obviously, Moldbug has his connections. Michael Anton being one of Moldbug's connections, but the degree to which Anton is talks about the frogs, so to speak, and talks about Bronze Age mindset, but is also, was a White House staffer. And the degree to which this essay in particular, I guess, was so well received by more respectable. Well, obviously Andrew Sullivan got in trouble, as you said, but I was also struck. I guess there was a famous not incident, but a famous case where part of the reception of the Flight 93 election essay was that Rush Limbaugh dedicated part of his show to reading it off, which means it reached a massive normie/normie audience, and as we said,
Definitely.
probably really did influence a lot of and enthuse a lot of voters, which remains fascinating. Remains kind of singular. I don't know if there's how many other cases there are of someone like Anton with the proximity that he does have to some really interesting thinkers, but also crossing over to that really widespread normie con, so to speak, audience. And it's something I'd like to see more of. And it's something that I think, not to get ahead of ourselves, but in the other essay, the Moldbug essay, I feel like Yarvin, over the past few years, has kind of edged a little bit towards, reaching that kind of audience too, which is huge, and one of the very kind of good developments of the past few years.
Absolutely. And these, when you say that Flight 93 reached a mainstream audience, and that is somewhat singular, hasn't really happened very recently, I think it's important to drill down on the fact that it is rare for any essay to really move history, but yet there is a history of essays moving history. And so this does follow in a tradition of just, I'm sure Anton will appreciate these comparisons as well as Yarvin, but Common Sense, Thomas Paine, the Federalist Papers, Martin Luther's Theses, the letter from a Birmingham jail by MLK, even Mein Kampf.
Yes.
Well, realistically, it certainly had an impact.
No, it's obviously we are here partially to talk about literature, and I think part of our idea for this episode was to talk about the essay and the political essay as a literary form. And I think that Flight 93 election is just such a good example of something that's both, a pleasure to read and really had that sort of illocutionary effect.
Exactly.
Of getting people to the polls in 2016, and I think it is in line with some of these essays you describe.
I think, when we look back on it, already the Flight 93 election is in the lexicon, and we're 5 years away, and that is, I don't think it's going away, and that's something that he saw a situation. He described it in a way that was, memorable and apt, and that's good writing. And I think what the two essays share here, and not just that they bookend the Trump presidency, Flight 93 being a kind of prelude to it, and Victis being not even a denouement, an epilogue.
Postmortem,
Yes, a postmortem, where I think we already mentioned that Yarvin described the various shenanigans that did or did not go on in the 2020 election,
right,
and how we'll get into it, but his ultimate takeaway is that power is what elections are about. And to the extent that we do not understand that, that's a fault of ours, not really a fault of the systems, because the system is not really a democracy, or a democracy is not actually a democracy.
Right. Well, that's
whole point there.
Yeah, that's in true sort of NRX form, but also put compellingly, not simply ideologically. Yarvin describes the degree to which there's always, well, we'll get into this later, but that there's always, his basic thesis is there's always election shenanigans. Whether or not they're what ultimately moves the needle is perhaps besides the point, and that there's no real proof that in 2020 that they were what moved the needle. But nevertheless, his point is that they are part of the game, and whoever can more effectively come out on top, well, that's just part of justifying power in the West, in the United States. etc. But I think the main point we're trying to make right now is that these two essays, the Flight 93 election from 2016 and Vi Victis from 2020, really provide these bookends for this influential period.
Clear literary merit.
Right.
And, yeah.
They echo back to each other in interesting ways as well.
Definitely. And one thing that we were talking about that I think is, speaks very well for their writerly skills is that these essays, though they deal with kind of complicated politics and complicated ideas, are written in a very colloquial manner.
Right.
And very readable, very you do not need a degree from anywhere to read this. In fact, maybe it would even help if you didn't. And in order to, and this is just something that I took away from it, because I at a certain point, like many, nerds, I just tried to write political essays because I'm like, oh, my ideas are, pretty spot on. And so it's hard. It's really hard to write about politics in a way that doesn't lapse into a sort of academic style that is boring and dead, because at least in my experience, conveying complicated ideas requires complicated explanation. Mm-hmm. And you're relying on the full arsenal of this is how I break down, difficult concepts. And this is how I, use, language to explain things that are sophisticated. And if you're able to do that without using very academic language, then you're a pretty good writer.
Yeah.
And what's more than being a pretty good writer, you know the material very well. Certainly. And that's something that Anton and Yarvin share. They clearly know this material, their sense of 20th century history, of modern history, and even ancient history, especially ancient history, and with regard to Yarvin at least, is spot on.
Absolutely. I mean, in fairness, just not to put down Yarvin in any way, but just to give my take on what you're saying, I would give this crown, this praise, I would heap even more heavily onto Anton's essay. I mean, again, that this could both be such an exciting work for people, on our corner of Twitter, but also sounds so good coming from Rush Limbaugh's mouth. And I should try and find the recording. I'm sure it's interesting to hear. And for that audience, really shows that this was, in that Thomas Paine common sense vein, an essay for everyone in a way that's extremely effective. Yarvin, yeah. I do think, I don't even know why I need to qualify this, because I do think both essays are fantastic. Yarvin's obviously is a little bit more a little bit more of a big brain focus, a little bit more in the sort of blog post form, as opposed to the kind of really, really popular essay that Flight 93 is. But nevertheless, I think that Yarvin, some people are iffy. Some people don't like Yarvin's writing as much, but I do, and I think that he his ability to make entertaining sort of blog style writing has always been one of his strengths. So it's a slightly more refined, bigger brained audience that he's aiming at, but nevertheless, I do think both are written in a style. I agree with you there. Both are written in a style that has its appeal, and that is deceptively entertaining for the level of idea that it presents.
Yeah. I think with regard to Yarvin, there's definitely a sense that he is writing to people who already understand him.
Right, a little bit more so than Flight 93, but nevertheless, they are both rhetorically effective and entertaining pieces.
Yeah, absolutely. And the reason why is because they use not only colloquial language, but excellent metaphors.
Right, and both hinge on a kind of critical metaphor.
Exactly. And so the Flight 93 election, quite obviously, hinges upon the metaphor of Flight 93. And Flight 93, it struck me as that is incredible, an incredibly apt and memorable way to characterize a moment in time, but an election. And what Anton did there was he reached back and he grabbed a moment of singular American valor, and he used that and infused it into the metaphor of this election. Because what in recent memory is a more valorous moment than the doomed passengers of Flight 93 charging the cockpit? And conspiracy theories be damned. Whatever you happen to believe, like let's table that and say this. This is what happened. And I mean, like it's incredible.
Yeah, no, it is incredible. No, it's worth clearing our throat on that about the conspiracy theory thing. Because, man, I feel like I haven't heard this is the Anton's essay is like the one example. Flight, not just 9/11, but Flight 93 in particular. Out of the last maybe 10 times it's come up in my conversations, in my reading online, this is maybe the one time when it was presented not in some kind of conspiratorial light. But nevertheless, yeah, again, to put it aside, as Anton does, it's not he obviously doesn't touch on that at all. It's a really effective image. It's something that even someone below the age of 30 can remember very, very well. And obviously an unparalleled, image of valor, as you said. And I think most critically, you mentioned that you had come across this in 2016, and it seemed to paint a very dire situation for the country that you didn't necessarily agree with at the time. I certainly didn't have this perspective in 2016, which we'll get into later. But again, so we weren't necessarily on board in that way. But the strength of the metaphor is that it really says, it just paints the situation as being so dire. The stakes inherent to that metaphor could not be more high. Obviously, it's life and death. In this case, the life and death of the country as we know it. And it's difficult to imagine a metaphor that better conveys that. And any lesser metaphor, any metaphor where the stakes were slightly, less. I'm trying to think of what such a metaphor could even be. But if it didn't really paint it as a airplane, hurtling towards a building, the essay would not have had the force that it had. So it was an aptly picked metaphor. And, that's a literary feat. Obviously, the essay is a political feat, and it makes a lot of good logical arguments, but that emotional literary metaphor is truly what gives the essay its strength.
Absolutely. And one line I particularly liked was and this too is a metaphor, that voting for Trump was like playing Russian roulette. And, you got a 5 out of 6 chance that you'll be fine. 1 out of 6 that you blow your brains out. And voting for Hillary, in his estimation at the time, was like playing Russian roulette with a semi-auto. And obviously, I mean, like the hilarious part of that is you cannot play Russian roulette with a semi-auto. It just doesn't work that way. You can't, spin the barrel. You're just going to, obviously just going to blow your brains out.
Yeah.
And, but I mean, that's the humor of that was just as I was reading it, I'm just like, oh, that's really funny. And that stuck with me too.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And I think we will get onto this later. I know we want to talk about the other metaphor, the Victis metaphor, as well, maybe before getting into the more personal angle. But man, thinking about the stakes of that 2016 election and the way it was perceived at the time by people who were red-pilled, so to speak, or were involved in these ideas which we now deal in on this podcast and on our Twitter lives, etc. Man, it brings me back to that it does and doesn't bring me back to that moment, because I can put myself in the shoes of someone looking at that election and feeling that way. To an extent, it's the way I feel now, not about any particular election, but just about the political future. It's like it's that sense of it being unclear. We're still playing Russian roulette, but maybe there's some kind of chance, and we have to lean into that. I can put myself in those shoes, and I looked at the date. I think it was September 5th. I don't have it right in front of me. It's September 5th or 6th, 2016. Just remembering where I was and just that moment of uncertainty, and not a moment I was intimately familiar with at the time, but it clearly encapsulates a moment nonetheless, and makes me nostalgic. The excitement, the possibility, the hope is palpable in the essay, which makes it maybe a pleasure, maybe a bit of a sadness, but maybe just a nostalgia to read. And it is sad precisely in light of what is discussed in Moldbug's essay, Victis. So if you want to get into that metaphor before we get into that contents.
Yeah, no, I do, but also I want to respond to your isolating it as a moment in time, because I remember that too. And the pre-2016 election world, it was different. And what was different, I remember in that September, that October, and, maybe this is just because I was, more blue-pilled then, but I think we all, as a society, were more blue-pilled, and everyone thought that, of course, Trump isn't going to win, and this is a fucking crazy thing that's like happening, but like we all know how it's going to end,
right?
And like, but it was like there is this potential that the world is about to change in an insane manner, and like, yes, at that time it felt insane. And that was that moment in time for me in September to November, and afterwards, when the world seemingly got turned on its head. But Victis, providing the postmortem, shows us that the world was, in some respects, already on its head.
Right.
And
in some
revealed it to us.
The world was already on its head, and also that specific moment, Trump's victory, November 2016, didn't necessarily change much. It was already on its head, but it's not like it became all that much more on its head during that presidency. It's like Mold and Victis. It starts with the premise that the world is on its head, but within that premise, there is this sense of there's very little, that we as voters can do to change. I don't remember. I don't think it's in Victis. I think actually Moldbug talked about it on his frankly very good interview with Tucker, where he describes, the political events in the United States in this era, especially with regard to elections. In this era with very limited powers to the executive branch, as being like a thunderstorm, hundreds of thousands of feet above sea level, and you're swimming around in your coral reef or what have you, and there's like a light sort of shaking in the water. That's our perspective on these political rumblings that happen. But at the end of the day, we're deep within water, in that David Foster Wallace sense of that's this is just our reality, and it actually isn't that affected by these ostensible rumblings. Would seem to be a big part of Moldbug's worldview in general, but also that things are kind of topsy-turvy and on their head in the first place. I mean, to back up a half step again, I mean, that summer of 2016, I too did not think Trump would win. I was not a Trump supporter then.
Nor I.
Right.
Yeah.
I've written about this. Maybe I'll link it in the description. It is sort of addendum to my novel, which was somewhat influenced by my experience of that period of time. I kind of wrote about, my experience of the 2016 election and not thinking Trump had a chance, and being a sort of blue-pilled, conservative sort of quasi-liberal. I mean, I write about that, but that moment, basically being a bit of a status quoist at the time, and not thinking Trump would win. But nevertheless, I definitely there was something in the air long before Trump won, and really culminating around that time that the Flight 93 election came out, that the country was changing inevitably, that all these chaotic forces were coming to light. I mean, that 2016, obviously not as hectic as 2020, but at the time it felt pretty hectic with some of the BLM stuff and the Dallas incident, and also abroad. I remember there being a lot of ISIS activity and terror stuff. Like, definitely the world felt distinctly tumultuous, and there was great forces were on the move, so to speak, and I remember that feeling. But to finish the thought, I don't even know where I'm necessarily going with this, but just, reflecting
I'm with you.
on my own experience and reflecting on this essay, it is unbelievable to me how, and maybe this is just getting older or something, but how almost, I hesitate to use this word, but almost innocent 2016 felt like compared to now.
Oh, yeah.
Because at least, and it comes across in the Flight 93 election, there is an innocence to that essay. That essay is definitely about, us being in a dire situation. And as I said, it was evident from, to everyone from political fringe political people to normies like I was at the time that, again, great and powerful forces were on the move. All of that was evident, but there was still this innocence to the sense that, maybe something could happen. Maybe there could be a Trump in the case of the hope inherent in Anton's essay. That wasn't my hope at the time, but I still had a certain degree of hope. Like, this is chaotic, but things are going to come back to some kind of norm, or something's going to happen, something's going to change. 2020 plus, pandemic era plus, right up to the moment now, I not to be a black pillar, I'm not to be even particularly pessimistic. It just feels like there's so much muck, and as Yarvin describes in the essay, and maybe there was in 2016 too, but it's not how I was feeling. So much going on below the surface in the 2020 election, as Yarvin describes, but now even post 2020 election, I no longer have that sense that I'm living in a straightforward reality like that. It just I kind of take for granted, the type of view that Moldbug presents in Victis, that politics is largely ineffective and there's not a lot we can do. And there's a lack of, I don't fully take, the political scenario, the political situation seriously. There's a non-seriousness to it. And I can't imagine either a Trump or an Obama arising out of it. Is kind of that's like my loss of innocence from 2016 to 2020. That's maybe charted in the essays.
I think a part of that is explained in Victis with the metaphor that Yarvin uses of the gigaphone. And the gigaphone is a literary device that he employs to say that during Trump's presidency and continuing now, the cathedral, which is another metaphor, which we all pretty much know, but we'll get into, employs the media and the sense making organs of the body politic to promote a certain message. And if that message is that the January 6th protesters are insurrectionists, that's one of them. All sorts of various messages that hammer home a certain point. And what happened during the Trump presidency, according to Yarvin, is the gigaphone, as he describes it, the ability of the cathedral, the sense-making elite, to get over ideas, promote ideas, was turned up so loud for so long that now we kind of see that it's fake.
Right.
And
I think,
and that's what happened to us over these 4 years. That's frankly what red pilled me. What red pilled me was seeing that the media was just so in the tank, and that the media, while being in the tank, like during the BLM riots, protests, whatever you want to call them, the way they presented the medical establishment, saying that you don't have to worry about COVID if you're going to a protest, which was it was just insane the way, and the coverage was such and is so and continues to be so one-sided and unfair that it became blatantly obvious.
I think so, yeah.
And it broke it didn't break people, it set them free. It broke their chains.
Right.
And they realized, oh, wait a minute. And so for me, what it did for me, this metaphor of the gigaphone was turned up so loud that it woke me up. And I'm like, for many people, what it did is it's like, oh shit, if I say that, that it's, disingenuous or, hypocritical to protest and forget about COVID, but otherwise COVID's a really big deal. If I say that, I'm a bad person, I'm going to lose my job, I'm going to this. Many people got that, and they don't think further. They're just like, well, I'm, and it's a reasonable way to be. You want to preserve your money. Exactly. You want to preserve your family. You want to, and so you don't want to look too deeply into things. You just want to do what people tell you to do so you can eat, so you can, right. Take care of your people.
Which is perfectly reasonable. But you're saying a lot of people are now doing it, and this is my impression.
I wish I could be that way. Yeah. But the problem is the gigaphone, it doesn't interact with everyone the same way. Some people see the hypocrisy and it bothers them. And it couldn't not bother me.
Of course.
And so, I think that's what happened to a lot of people during the Trump presidency. Yarvin's gigaphone was turned up too loud, and people noticed.
And it hasn't gone down yet. You know what I mean? Even though we're about a year away from Trump's defeat in the election, we're still dealing with this kind of double think. I don't think either you or I, Dan, are total COVID skeptics, but everyone notices the hypocrisy. And when it comes to the protests and the way those are treated, everyone notices the hypocrisy. And the gigaphone, maybe it's gone down a little bit, but it's not gone fully down. The media has shattered its credibility. The degree to which the media was part and parcel of the Democratic Party and part and parcel of what we'd call the derp state or deep state is totally evident. And I think it's evident to a lot of people who didn't even vote for Trump. And I think that not even to get into any specifics, but a lot of people on the forum we met, Justin Murphy's forum, the sort of Justin Murphy crowd a little bit, or people adjacent to that, a lot of those people are probably Democrats, you know what I mean? But there's there was obviously a lot of red pill Republicans and nationalists and conservatives in 2016, but the thing I keep noticing, people I keep meeting, especially out here in California, is people who are they maybe voted for Biden, they're not about to necessarily vote for Trump in 24, but they are very aware of this gigaphone thing, and the media has shattered its credibility. They know that what the status quo that we have now is somehow broken in terms of the way, in terms of media and news and information, that there's something broken in that, and something very broken just in society and the way that we're allowed or not allowed to explore ideas. And that's one thing that I guess gives me hope. As you said, it's not quite as positive as everyone broke free. There's still a lot to combat against, but nevertheless, I think there is a growing body of people who are very ready for something very new.
Definitely,
and that does give me some hope.
Definitely, and I think something that it showed, what the gigaphone showed is, and I'm going to draw this to another Yarvin metaphor. It showed that everything is about power, and that it's not about, you thought the media was about truth, you thought that the cathedral, which is the sense-making apparatus of the body politic, you thought that was about actual ideas. It was about power, and it remains about power. It's about projecting power, controlling people, and that is essentially what victus, the metaphor itself of victus, is about. And this is a great entree in my explaining what victus is, because I think it's really cool.
Yeah.
It goes back to when Rome was a city-state. This is probably, I guess, oh God, I'm not an expert in history. I'm thinking probably 400 BC, 350 BC, something like that. At that time, Rome periodically, before Caesar killed most of them, was being overrun by Gauls and, various Germanic barbarians. And so one of these times, Rome was sacked, and the various elements that were still alive in Rome held out on this hill, And they, in exchange for the barbarians leaving, they bargained with the barbarian chieftain, the Gallic chieftain Brennus, and they bargained with him that he would leave if they gave him 1,000 pounds of gold. And so Brennus agreed. They got these big scales, and the Romans were piling on gold, and they felt that the counterbalance on the scale, and this is like an old style scale, so it has like something on one side that's 1,000 pounds, something on another, and they felt that he had piled on his side way more than 1,000 pounds. So they were, in order to balance it out, they were providing more than 1,000 pounds of gold. They were getting screwed. And they complained about this. And so Brennus shouted, Victis, and he threw his sword onto the pile of the counterbalance, adding the weight of his sword. And what Victis means is woe to the vanquished. And what that means, of course, is I won, fuck you.
Right.
And that is the message. If you're listening to the gigaphone, that's the message underneath the message. This is about power. This is like, the various challenges to the 2020 election. I mean, like, I couldn't even really follow it because, in the lead up to the election, the Hunter Biden stuff, the, Twitter and everyone colluding to black out a story that was almost like completely legitimate and like very certainly shouldn't have been blacked out. Mm-hmm. It seemingly actually was his laptop. And I don't know about the veracity of all of the emails, but in any case, it's something that certainly should have been looked into. But the collusion of the media to suppress that story, and the various ideological commitments of the people who count the votes, if people spend 4 years saying Donald Trump is Hitler. Well, don't you think they would, fuck around with the votes to get Hitler out?
And Yarvin says that, that's always been one of my predominant thoughts. I have not, as you said, I've not followed closely every in and out of the story of was there not any kind of fraud. But from the beginning, I thought there's definitely ample motivation. I mean, that's a matter of public record. But no, I shouldn't go too far into this without saying, I concur with Yarvin, and I think with you, Dan, and I think with a lot of people that I don't have any proof that there was fraud on anything like a large enough scale to affect the outcome of the election.
Correct.
But so and that's where I stand with it. But Yarvin says, there's motivation. We don't, do we really try? There's certain cities, one thing that always struck me, this is kind of an aside, but one thing that always struck me is it seems like the place that maybe they looked into it the most was Arizona. But it strikes me the places where I would be the most suspicious of are cities like Philadelphia, like Detroit, there's corrupt city officials, and I don't have proof of this, but that's where I would have looked. And I say this partially because one thing I actually learned about American history from Victis is Yarvin's description of, I think, the 1960 Nixon-Kennedy election. I asked a friend of mine who's pretty well versed in history, who said, it's basically considered likely that Illinois probably should have gone to Nixon that year, and that there was that they basically did something very similar to what the accusation would be against these states in 2020, that they held off to wait to see what kind of totals they need, and then they released the totals late. And apparently, in that case, a lot of historians think there probably was. But the other thing that this friend of mine, who I was asking a bit more about this case, said, because Yarvin just kind of does it as a footnote, was that, yes, Illinois probably should have gone to Nixon, but that singular thing was not what tipped that election. So that was kind of instructive to me, too. Right now, I would say, if you ask me with the 2020 election, I would say there may well have been certain fraud, but was it enough to tilt the scale of the election? Probably not. I think Biden, for reasons that not only that the mainstream media would tell us, but also that the 5%ers of the world, if if our listeners are familiar with that whole meme. For those reasons as well, Trump's declining popularity with white males, the general sense he wasn't very effective. I think that also, is probably why he lost as well. So,
Yeah.
Yeah,
I mean, I think the important point is there's no way to really know. Like, there's no way to, like, I do believe that, yeah, Biden probably won. Those are good reasons. But, like, the point is, like, you can't trust the media. You can't trust the vote counters. So, like, who fucking knows, really?
Yeah.
And that's a problem. And that is, okay, so yeah, that is a problem. And then, like, when, the various, like, challenges to the Supreme Court, the Supreme Court dismissed a lot of these challenges on procedural grounds. And then the media turns to it, and they're like, well, they lost a bunch of court challenges. And it's like, well, okay, but they lost the challenge because it was based on the doctrine of mootness, which is, like, essentially whether you have standing to bring a case. And it's like the court saying, like, nah, you actually can't bring this case because we're not going to let you. I mean,
Yeah.
It's like, these are the things that, are determining the outcome of the election.
Yeah.
And that is, that shows you that whether who had the most votes is kind of, and the thing is, like, in all of these elections right now, the country is so divided, it's going to always be incredibly close. And when it's this incredibly close, it's not really who has the most votes who wins, because it's really hard to even figure out who has the most votes, because who really has the most votes is the person who has the most power, because if you have the most power, you can turn votes into votes.
Right. And I think that Yarvin's point, I don't want to mischaracterize it, but his point is, like, at some point, no, it's, it's like, it's not who gets the most votes. It never was that way. But it's about, but getting votes is obviously a big part of it, but it's about then leveraging that to justify power. And there's a whole apparatus beyond simply votes that justifies power. And one of his key arguments is that, there's always a lot that goes on beyond just voting, whether it's fraud or whether it's the courts making decisions. In 2000, I guess that technically went the Republicans' way. Not that most Republicans nowadays would be, remember Bush too fondly. But nevertheless, there's always that extra level of justification or lack of justification of power. And Yarvin, being neither a Democrat in the sense of being a Democrat, part of the Democratic Party, but also just not pro-democracy, has no problem with that and thinks that's part and parcel of the whole deal, and encourages, I don't think he's encouraging Republicans to deal in fraud per se, but I do think he is encouraging us to, think harder about the way, we kind of justify our own power and what we do with that power, which is another key thesis of Victis is his critique of Trump for his failure to use what power he did have to affect the kind of change that, Moldbug would have liked to see.
So I think that Yarvin, in describing Trump, he obviously was very hard on him. He didn't vote for him the second time around. Like myself. And, but one thing, and I share this with Yarvin as well, what a good thing that came from the Trump presidency is the introduction of something that Yarvin refers to as dream politics.
Right.
Which is, and this is something that we've talked about before in terms of the magic of the frog Twitter, of the manosphere, to manifest a game show host as president.
Yeah.
It's dream politic. It's like you can, and it's coming up against, it happened, and then the cathedral kicked into overdrive, turned up the gigaphone to 11 because they realized that, like, holy shit, the people can actually they're capable of uniting and, memeing things that we don't want to happen into existence. And so if Trump showed that, you know, the meme of President Trump could travel through 4chan all the way to the White House, if it showed that, then it could show us other similar passages. Dream politic could, it could lead to our immanentizing. Pronouncing that correctly?
Yeah.
certain other things that we want. And, maybe it's not game show host president. Maybe it's,
Tucker Carlson is president. I don't know.
Tucker,
no, I don't know. Everyone says opposite about that. Yeah.
I was going to do the Caesar pill, but yeah, whatever.
Yeah, no. Well, what Moldbug wants pretty unequivocally is some kind of Caesar,
obviously we know Moldbug wants Caesar.
Right, but even other possibilities remain open. I mean, this is what he describes as the project of his blog, Gray Mirror, and of his work as of late. I mean, I guess if you look at his unqualified reservations, his old blog, you could look at that as kind of his, the Moldbugian worldview laid out. I guess this second leg of his blogging career with Gray Mirror is more about this idea of dream politic and more about this idea of, frankly, regime change. Soft regime change, but regime change nonetheless. And dreaming that up. It's something he's committed to. And I think it's in an essay where he says, Trump didn't prove himself willing to lead. Moldbug, no one was more of a Trump supporter than Moldbug in 2016, is my understanding. I think he had this hope that he could be this American Caesar that he was not. So he's quite harsh on Trump, as we've said in Victis, but will ultimately, the final sort of nod he does give to Trump is that he validated this idea of dream politic and helps, the creative few to potentially, imagine themselves, not necessarily as president, but it unlocked our imaginations for potential alternatives. I mean, I think even this is a ridiculous example, but I'll say it nonetheless. Even like the whole Kanye West of it all. I remember him saying like, "Oh, Trump showed that anyone can be president." Maybe that's not the best interpretation of that, but it's almost a version of what Moldbug.
There's something to that.
Yeah.
Moldbug in an interview, and we're gonna give a little shout out here to Good Old Boys.
Mm-hmm.
He was on Good Old Boys, a pod that we both like.
Yes.
And he said something to the effect of, riffing on this idea of dream politic, that the American public today, more so than 20 years ago, 30 years ago, is it's a postmodern audience. And they are, looking for symbols and meaning. And the example that he gave is a movie like Inception from like 2010 would not work in the 80s.
Right.
People in the 80s would see it and they'd be like, what the fuck? I'm supposed to know this is a dream and this is a symbol for that and this and that. And whereas, people in 2010, they're just like, oh yeah, of course, this is a symbol for that. And it's not like, these are scholars, these are just like teenagers or something.
No, it's a really compelling example he gives there. And I don't want to be Mr. Actually here, but I actually think he said 80s, yes, I agree it wouldn't have made sense in the 80s, but I think it's even more effective to think like the 50s or the early 60s. Like in 80s, you might get some stragglers, but I'm trying to, for me, that metaphor is even more effective to imagine, highly educated people of the 50s, just like, I think it would have come across as gibberish.
Yeah. But today, it's something that his point is that the American people are ready to make leaps of imagination.
Yes.
Leaps of intuitive leaps. And they don't need to be persuaded with a lot of messaging, a lot of, nudging in this and this direction. They are ready to turn on a dime when they get the right meme. When they get the meme that kind of like is just like, oh, this is that. and they see that, and then they just go for it. And that is, maybe very optimistic, maybe not very optimistic, because it could be a meme that we don't particularly like.
No, yeah, I think it's quite neutral, but it is definitely a sign that change is inevitable and that change will come. I mean, again, to go back to even obviously 2016, it was already a pretty postmodern time, but even compared to 2016 now, I'm just so much more enmeshed in viewing the world and politics as this deep, deep layers of non-seriousness and ineffectiveness. But within that, there is possibility, for sure. And that's, I think, part of what Moldbug means by dream politic. Worth noting, I believe Ross Douthat, the resident New York Times conservicon, use it as a diss to Trump initially, to say he dealt in dream politics. He's this populist, whittling out these ideas that he can't execute upon. Maybe he ultimately couldn't, but nevertheless, and Yarvin acknowledges that, but nevertheless, there still is this place in Yarvin's heart, in political imagination for just the mere notion of these kinds of ideas. And I think that Yarvin still hangs his hat on that there is, there's this increasing sense that, as we talked about earlier, there's this increasing sense of illegitimacy of those in power that Trump ushered in, and you don't have to like Trump necessarily to acknowledge that he stripped the veil away, and now it is much more evident, that we're living in a less legitimate regime. And I think that is, whether you want to call it positive, negative, or neutral, sort of the moment we find ourselves in post-2020 election, now 2021, this growing sense of illegitimacy in the air, which is scary, but also pregnant with potential.
And speaking of pregnant with potential, and speaking of dream politic, this is a moment where dreamers and, people who are creators, people who are artists, have the opportunity to step up and play a role in culture that they rarely get to play. Because rarely is it the case that everything is up for grabs the way it is right now. And that is, it hits right to the center of our mission statement, which is we want to provide a platform for and discuss dissident art. And what this moment calls for is dissident art. It calls for art that is addressed to an audience that is outside of the cathedral, or if they're in the cathedral, they want to hear voices from the outside. This is the time for a new right, if you will.
Mm-hmm. Right. No, I did a conversation with Gio Panichetti, from Gio's Art Corner on Twitter a few months back on Robert Stark's podcast. We got to get Gio on this podcast, but we talked about something similar.
I listened to that one, actually.
Yeah, it's definitely one of the better episodes I've done with Robert recently. But and you mentioned this metaphor earlier, we're in the wilderness right now, following Trump's defeat via Victis. And it is a wilderness, but within that wilderness, it's a opportunity for tremendous kind of, I'll just call it spiritual growth. Not that we're dealing in religion here per se, but it's a time to kind of mold ourselves and mold our views. And I think it's a very creative time, and at a time when looking at things from a more cultural angle rather than electoral is fruitful. And that's a big part of, I think, why we wanted to do this podcast, and we'll continue to do it.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Indeed. In terms of, so we talked about how these two essays kind of bookend the Trump presidency, and we've talked about what has changed from 2016 to 2020. A lot has changed in some ways. Not a lot has changed in others. But one comparison that I found myself making between the two essays is how they make their upshots are very different, because the upshot of one is basically a call to action to go vote in the case of Flight 93 essay, and the call to action in the other is kind of what we just described in terms of dream politic and dreaming up new alternatives. Those are different calls to action. But where they definitely converge is that both are totally pessimistic about sort of the mainstream conservative establishment, conservative money, so to speak. That's a big part of what Flight 93 does. Before even saying much positive about Trump, it just talks about how conservatives and the conservative movement has basically, devolved to a movement which shows up to lose every few years, or even when it wins, it's basically just a retarder on, inexorable progress. I mean, that's kind of what the conservative movement has been perhaps for decades. And a big part of Anton's point in the essay is that we should not be complacent with that, and that rather we really should take our conservative or right-wing understanding of human nature seriously and pose an alternative. He sees a hope in Trump that maybe doesn't come into fruition. The commonality between that and what I see in Victis is that I think Yarvin too is just very, lays on the criticism of any kind of smaller-minded Republican or conservative or right-wing thinkers who are sort of content just to take these small symbolic victories. The difference is that Trump is kind of the focal point of Yarvin's target. I mean, I kind of read Victis as taking a similar point to what Anton makes about the uselessness of mainstream conservatism, conservative ink, and also saying that Trump ended up kind of being part of this. Was that your read on it too, to an extent?
More or less, yeah. Well, I mean, I think that Anton clearly differentiates between Con Inc., which is, very, very Coke influenced, and is some of which the more right populist side of Con Inc., to the extent it has that side, is just, fraudulent. They just, they mouth the words, but they cash the checks, and they're content to never get anything done. And, indeed, they won't, even if they are red-pilled, they're never going to say it. And I think that Yarvin's take on that is, more or less the same. And that Trump, I think that Trump, in Yarvin's estimation, is, he's not, he's not like someone who's just cashing the check, because he's not even in on the game. He doesn't understand the game. He's someone who showed up and he got rolled.
Right.
And
maybe the difference is, I don't think that Yarvin would say, or Anton certainly wouldn't say, that Trump showed up to lose. He showed up to win. Make no mistake. And to his credit, he showed up to win, but he didn't win. So I guess that is the difference.
Yeah.
He's not. I think Trump is still an exceptional, and I don't mean exceptional as goodness, so I just mean he's an exception to the norm, for sure. But he nevertheless lost. And that's what's so dismaying, but again, woe to the vanquished.
Well, yeah, woe to the vanquished. And I think that in the sense of, yes, tying it again to that dream politic, what Trump did was he busted the Overton window open.
Right.
And it almost, you needed a maniac to do that. For someone to say, Mexico is not sending its best people, there's a lot of truth to that. And, but in order to say that, you had to be the type of person who's willing to, set himself on fire. And, to say, various other things that Trump has said. You have to be the type of person who is either so brave as to be, retarded, basically.
Yeah.
And that's what Trump was. He was just he was a game show host as president.
Right.
Shock jock as president. But what he did was he got people thinking.
Right.
He expanded the Overton window. He made it possible that, in this world of dream politic, now I don't know if it's Ron DeSantis. I don't know if it's Blake Masters. I don't know if it's someone who we haven't heard of. But someone is going to take these issues and have the same level of bravery, not the same level of bravery, because Trump did it. He did it first. So you don't have to be as brave to say something that someone already said that was very difficult to say. So he charged the Maxim guns and he got shot to pieces.
Right.
And what this means is, but maybe he took out the nest. He took out the machine gun nest. Yeah. And this means that the next guy, he can really put some miles on the scoreboard or whatever.
Exactly.
He can run with it.
Well, look, I don't want to force an optimistic ending to this, but look, Yarvin and Anton are they're indeed friends, and they agree on a lot. So it's not as if these two essays are coming from a completely different place. And I think that, in a way, Victis, for as pessimistic as it is to any Republican reader, it validates an element, I would say, of the Flight 93 election. It's saying that, look, we took this shot, we rolled the barrel. I don't think we shot ourselves in the head. It didn't exactly go as we wanted to, but nevertheless, we did it, and how it ultimately shakes out is not clear, but nevertheless, it was good to at least try, and in trying, things have been irrevocably changed, and it's not even as corny or as simple as that there's still hope, but there's still a possibility. And I think that's what Anton and Yarvin both agree.
Yeah, for sure.